Those words ring even more true when we look at what's happening in other conflicts, including the current turmoil in Iraq. CCTV's Jessica Stone takes a closer look for some insight.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours.
It was March 20th, 2003. The U.S. ordered targeted airstrikes on Baghdad, a move that would ultimately keep the American military engaged in Iraq for 8 more years. The U.S. went on to spend more than $1 trillion, while more than 4,500 American troops were killed.
It was the wrong war at the wrong time at tremendous cost for Iraqis and for Americans. And it created conditions that certainly Al-Qaeda and now ISIS, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, is taking advantage of.
There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq when we went in 2003. Now it is a major base both for Al-Qaeda and groups that are even more extreme.
3 years after American troops left Iraq, the Islamic militant group Islamic State, also known as ISIS, has taken over large swaths of Iraq and Syria. Almost 1,000 American special forces are back on the ground in an advisory role, and U.S. airstrikes are once again targeting Iraq, this time in the north. The ouster of Saddam Hussein allowed the Shia Muslim majority oppressed under Hussein to take back control of the government. That in turn led to an alienation of Iraq's Sunnis and gave Iran unprecedented influence.
The end result of it was, through democratic elections, Iran's closest allies in the world became the government of Iraq. That clearly was an unintended consequence. I think most Americans would question whether that was something worth the expenditure.
Paul Salem of the Middle East Institute says the realities of the American political system mean politicians will inevitably set mainly short-term foreign policy goals.
In the U.S., where every 2 years there's an election, every 4 years there's a presidential election, decisions are largely made on a political timetable, and those are very short timetables. The real challenge, I think, with long-term consequences is obviously they're very hard to predict. I mean, even if you wanted to try.
In the late 1970s and 80s, the United States government backed the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors, in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. They eventually gave rise to the Taliban, who would give rise to Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda, which would later launch the worst terror attack on the United States in history. This strategy, Salem says, was dangerous from the beginning.
Keep in mind, Saudi Arabia was a main, backer and organizer and ideological informer, in a sense, of the Mujahideen movement. And Osama bin Laden, who is a Saudi, or was a Saudi national, declared, the government of Saudi Arabia as one of his main enemies. So even those who know that community well had a blind spot to that this could come back and be a major problem for them.
Decades later, when faced with the option to arm the so-called moderate opposition in Syria against the government of Bashar al-Assad, the administration of U.S. President Barack Obama has been more cautious.
I do think that support for the non-crazy, non-radical Syrian opposition was the right thing to do. I think the people of Syria who really did demand change, and they were not offered it really by the Syrian government, also deserved probably more support than they got.
But even here in Syria, more unintended consequences of American foreign policy.
The policy of aiding the opposition has been one that didn't have a chance of overthrowing Assad, but has prolonged the war. And by prolonging the war, it inevitably has given an opportunity for the more extreme groups.
With a war-weary American public and a pledge from the current U.S. president to end the U.S. combat mission in Iraq, it has taken Washington some time to recognize the threat of the Islamic State. In fact, only in the past week have top U.S. military officials underscored that they believe it's the biggest threat they've seen. Jessica Stone, CCTV, Washington.